right, good morning, students. Welcome back. Hopefully you had a good week to catch up on everything. So we're going to start with just a quick trigonometry review. Now remember, I have pulled up here my Calculate 84 app, but your TI-84 calculator that you borrowed from us at school works just the same way. And so we're going to be starting with, again, we're going to be continuing with this trigonometry review. So let's start with some trig review. Okay, so one of the things that I want to kind of remind you of when we talk about trig review is that we are looking at the following phrase. So we want to remember Soh Cah Toa. Okay, and that's going to be our magic phrase. Okay, so keeping in mind that that's going to be our magic phrase, let's just remind you what that all means. So we have this function called sine, and sine takes an angle as input. And what sine is sine is the ratio of the opposite side of a right triangle to the hypotenuse side of a right triangle. Cosine is our next function. And again, that's cosine of an angle x, and that's going to be the ratio of the adjacent side of that right triangle to the hypotenuse. And remember, the hypotenuse is opposite the 90-degree angle. The opposite and the adjacent sides are relative to which angle is labeled x. And then finally, we have the tangent of angle x is equal to the opposite over the hypotenuse. Okay, so we've got these three ratios here. Now, let's just kind of go through how these work. So first off, we need to have a right triangle for this to work. And so with our right triangle, one of the angles has to be labeled x. So whatever angle we label x, everything is based off of that labeling. Now, what I'm going to recommend is that you always start by labeling the hypotenuse, and that's the easiest side to label because that is opposite the 90-degree angle. It's not one of the two angles based on angle x. The angle opposite angle x, so imagine you're in a triangular shaped room, you're standing in that corner, okay, which is labeled x, and you look across. The wall across from you is going to be our opposite side. Now, the wall next to you that you haven't already labeled, this is why it's so important to label the hypotenuse first. That last side is just going to be your adjacent side to angle x. Okay, so let's look at an example and see how this all works out. So I'm going to draw a right triangle. I'm going to pick an angle x, and let's do some labeling here. So we're going to start with the fact that this is a 3, 4, 5 right triangle. I need to give some side lengths to it. And I'm going to pick this angle up here to be x. Okay, so we're starting by labeling the hypotenuse. So the side labeled 5 for us, that's going to be the hypotenuse. Okay, opposite the angle x is the 4, so that's going to be our opposite side. And then next to the angle x is the 3, and that's our last side, so that's going to be the adjacent side. Okay. So now what the question that you might see come up, now remember, this is the first Delta Math assignment that we asked you to complete. We were asking for just the ratios. So we're asking here, what would the sine of x be? What would the cosine of x be? And what would the tangent of x be? Okay, so looking at this here between sine, cosine, and tangent, what we're going to see here, okay, specifically for sine, cosine, and tangent, is we're looking for the ratio. So we go up to Soh Cah Toa, remember, Soh Cah Toa, and sine is the opposite over the hypotenuse. So all we need to do for our answer here is we need to give sine as the opposite over the hypotenuse. So for us here, sine will be 4 over 5. For cosine, we want to use the adjacent over the hypotenuse, so we're going to use 3 over 5. And for tangent, we want to use opposite over, and look here, we've got an issue already. So tangent is the opposite over the adjacent, okay? Make sure that we have our TOA there. So opposite over adjacent, so 4 over 3. And that's it, right? And I know if you remember back to that first Delta Math assignment we had, some of them asked you to round, some of them asked you not to round. So just something to think about. Okay, so that was the kind of a review of the first part of trig that we looked at, finding the ratio of a triangle. Okay, of a trig formula for a triangle. So the next part that we're going to cover is when we solved for a missing side. Okay, so solving for the missing side. So again, we have to start off with a right triangle. And again, I know there's already videos for this, but it's important that we see and we start to review this a little bit. So this time, instead of us not knowing the angle, and the angle being x, we do know the angle. The angle is 60 degrees. And we have one side labeled, usually with a number, so I'm going to put an 8 there on the bottom. And one side is labeled with an x, and they're asking us to solve for that missing side. Basically, every time the steps don't really change all that much, we still have to label the triangle, okay? Because that's going to tell us which trig function to use. If we don't label, how do we know which trig function to use? So we're going to start with this side x here, and that's going to be our hypotenuse. Now, the angle 60 is here, so opposite that 60, we don't know anything about that side. We're still going to label it the opposite, but I don't know anything about that side. So we're going to leave that. And then next to the 60 is the 8, so the 8 will act as the adjacent side for this problem. So I have information, whether I know the full number or not, I have information about the hypotenuse and the adjacent. So which trig function uses hypotenuse and adjacent? Well, it's cosine. Okay, so the cosine is the ratio that we're going to use here. So we're going to use the fact that the cosine, now remember this time we actually know what the number is, so the cosine of 60, and remember cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. So for us it's going to be 8 over x. Okay, so now we put that cosine of 60 over 1 so we can cross multiply. Now, cross multiplication is a skill you're all familiar with, right? We have two fractions set equal to each other, and we're going to multiply up. So when we multiply the x and the cosine of 60, we're just going to get x times the cosine of 60. And we're going to get 1 times 8, which is just 8. Now, a lot of us, if they saw a problem like this on the Delta Math, had some issues with it. But again, you have to remember the idea here. And the idea here is that the cosine of 60 is a number, right? If I make sure, remember, first you want to make sure that your calculator is in degree mode, okay? So that's the first step. Once you make sure your calculator is in degree mode, again, you go to mode and make sure degree is highlighted, you can see by plugging in that cosine of 60 is actually a number. It's 0.5. So it's just like as if you had 2x equals 8. You would divide both sides by 2. Here you have x times cosine of 60, but cosine of 60 is just a number. So we're going to divide by the cosine of 60 on both sides. Okay? And so we're going to get x equals. Now into our calculator, we're going to plug 8 divided by the cosine of 60. And we're going to get 16. Now, depending on what sides are missing and what information you have, it's not always going to be x times the sine or x times the cosine. You might have just simply sine of 60 equals 1/2. You know, like you might get different relationships. The x is going to be in a different spot each time, but the algebra, it's still just, back to algebra 1, it's still just solving an algebraic equation, solving for the missing piece. Okay, so that was the second Delta Math assignment that you've seen for this. So now let's start some new material. So we're starting some new material, but I'm still going to start with that Soh Cah Toa on the top of my page. Okay, I want to remember bat, and I really need to encourage you, you gotta write this stuff down as we go. What do I mean by that? If you are not following along with us piece by piece, okay? All right, so let's get back to it. So again, going to talk about some new material now. So this new material is, we've talked about setting up the ratio for a trig function. We've talked about solving for the missing side for a trig function. Now we're going to solve for the angle. Okay, so when we're solving for the angle, if you look at your calculator, you'll notice that the three buttons go across the middle: sine, cosine, and tangent. You'll notice that above them, now depending on your calculator, the color might be slightly different, but it should be blue for most of us using a TI product. If you hit that second button and then the sign, you get sine and then this -1 power and then the number. You get, if you do cosine, right, we can clear that out. We could do second cosine, and we get the little thing above it, which is cosine -1. Or we could do second tan, and tan -1. Now, the only time we're ever going to hit that second button before sine, before cosine, or before tangent is if we're looking for the angle. Okay, that is, we're being asked to solve for the angle. So what happens here is the trig ratios don't change. And I think the best way to show you how this works is to show you by example. So we're going to do 3 different examples here. Here's the first one. Okay, so we've got our color. We're going to label some sides. All right, and I've got an angle X. So now here I'm not just being asked, right? What's the difference between the first Delta Math assignment, the top part we went over, and this? Is there I was just looking for you to set up the trig ratio. Here, I'm not just looking for you to set up the trig ratio. I'm looking for more than that. I'm looking for, I want to know, what is angle X? I want to know, is it 75 degrees? Is it 42.3 degrees? What is it? Okay, so let's look here, and the first thing that we're going to look at is radical 3. I've got a 2, and I've got an X. So the first step, again, as always, is label your sides. So there's my 90-degree angle, so opposite it, right? But I know I'm saying the word opposite, but across from the 90-degree angle is always going to be my hypotenuse. Then I look at angle X, the angle in question, and across from that is my opposite side. Okay, so I've got my radical 3 as the opposite, and then next to my X, there's nothing. So that's just the adjacent side, but we don't have any information for that. So we're going to be using the opposite and the hypotenuse. So now the next question for you becomes, wait a minute, which trig ratio uses opposite and hypotenuse? That's where Soh Cah Toa comes in, and that's going to be why we're using sine for this first example. So we're going to be using sine. So the sine of X, this time we don't know the angle, is equal to the opposite over the hypotenuse. Now, if the question is just asking you to find the ratio of sine, just like the first Delta Math assignment, then it's just radical 3 over 2. If they ask for a decimal, you plug that into your calculator. Here, though, they're not. They're asking us to solve for the angle. We want to know, what does X equal? And so this is where that second button on your calculator comes in. And this sine -1, cosine -1, tangent -1, we call that arc sine, arc cosine, or arc tangent. That's how we would pronounce that. Okay, so what we're going to be doing here is we're going to use arc sine. And arc sine is an inverse function. So what's actually happening here is we're taking the inverse of the inverse, right? So what's really happening here is we're doing the arc sine of both sides. But we're doing the arc sine of the sine of X we already have, right? And then we're doing the arc sine of radical 3 over 2. Now, the arc sine of sine, those are inverses of each other, so they just cancel out, and we're just left with x being equal to. Now, this is a step here that you'll see that we really won't ever do again, right? The idea is just simply, do you understand that to find the angle x, you're going to have to use this arc sine function, and that will tell you exactly what x is. But I do want to show it to you here because that is how it works. Okay, so we're being asked to complete the arc sine. So again, where did I get this from? I have the sine of x equals radical 3 over 2. I want to know what x is. So I'm telling you to find the angle x, you're going to have to use that second button on your calculator and then click sine. That's going to give you that arc sine function. And then we're going to plug in our function. So for us, that's radical 3 divided by 2. Okay, we're going to hit enter, and we're going to get 60. Okay, so x is equal to 60, and because we're in degree mode, that's going to be 60 degrees, and that is our missing answer. Okay, so let's try another example. Okay, so our second example here. So our second example here is going to look like the following. Remember, always has to be a right angle. Okay. So I've got the number 1, the number 2, and I'm going to label this angle x. Okay, so first things first, I have to label my sides. So across from the 90-degree angle is my hypotenuse. There is nothing across from the x this time, so that would have been my opposite. Okay. And then I've got this 1 next to the x, so that is my adjacent side. Okay, so now the question is, which trig ratio uses adjacent and hypotenuse? Because those are the two sides that I have information on. So again, that's why you have to write this Soh Cah Toa on the top of your paper, but the adjacent side is, and the hypotenuse is going to use cosine. So we're going to get the cosine of x is equal to the adjacent over the hypotenuse, so 1 over 2. Okay. Again, they're asking us to solve for the angle. So to do it this time without any of that, fancy, it's just simply going to be written as x equals the arc cosine of 1 over 2. Okay, I'm asked to solve for the angle. If it was just like the first assignment, I'm just leaving it as 1/2. That's what cosine of x is. I'm not being asked what the cosine of x is. I'm being asked what is x equal to. So for my calculator, I'm going to plug in second cosine, 1 divided by 2. And when I hit enter, it's going to tell me that it's 60 degrees. X equals 60. Okay, so there we go. We've got x equals 60. All right, and let's look at one more example while we're at it. Okay. All right, so let's change up which one is the angle this time. So I'm going to call this the angle x. I've got a side labeled radical 3 and a side labeled 1. Okay, so time to label our sides. You gotta start by labeling the sides, ladies and gentlemen. Across from the 90-degree angle is my hypotenuse. Now here we know nothing about that hypotenuse, but that's okay. The x is in a different corner than you're typically seeing it, but that's okay. Again, the same rules apply. It's still what's across from the x is the opposite. So there's our 1, that's going to be the opposite. And then next to the x, which has not already been labeled, that's why we label the hypotenuse first. That third side is the adjacent side. Okay, so we now have the adjacent side and we have the opposite side. So the question becomes, which trig ratio uses opposite and adjacent? And if we go to Soh Cah Toa, we can see that Toa uses it. So tangent. So we're going to have the tangent of angle x is equal to the opposite over the adjacent. So when we plug in the numbers, 1 over radical 3. Okay, again, they're asking us to solve for the angle. And since they're asking us to solve for the angle, what are we going to do? we're going to do tangent of x equals 1 over radical 3. We're going to solve for x equals, and then we're going to have to use arctangent. Okay, and we're just plugging in exactly what we had. So that'll allow us to get our angle. Okay, so we come over to our calculator, and we're going to get second tan, 1 divided by, and then we're going to plug in radical 3. And this time we get x equals 30, okay? And that's 30 degrees. Now, with delta math, when you go to do this on delta math, just plug in x equals 30. Do not try and plug in a degree symbol, okay? Don't do it. Don't do it. Okay, now, that's it for the new material here. Next time, we're going to remember how to do this with radians and degrees. So you may want to spend some time going back and looking at what it meant to convert between the two, because we did have both radians and degrees that we've been talking about this year. It's been a while since we talked about how to convert between the two. I think it was back somewhere between Thanksgiving and Christmas, but it's important that you do look at that. We will do a quick review on it, so don't worry too much, but if you can, take some time and look at that. Okay, with today's video, that should help you be able to complete the next Delta Math assignment, which you'll see. Also, another thing that I'm going to try and do, I want to try and make things a little bit more scheduled for you so you know exactly what to see. So the plan is to give you 2 of these videos/assignments each week going forward. One on Monday and one on Wednesday. The idea being that I'm going to post on Monday morning and I'm going to post on Wednesday morning. The assignment from Monday morning would be due Wednesday night, okay? Even though I'm going to already post that second assignment, it won't be due just yet. I want to give everyone as much time as possible. And then there'll be one that goes up Wednesday morning, just again to give everyone as much time as possible. And then you would have until the end of the weekend to complete that next assignment, okay? You got to keep up with these assignments, though, because we are, remember, the only way you get Regents credit now is if you pass the class. So if you leave these assignments outstanding and you're not completing these assignments, then you're going to have a very hard time passing the class because these do count as a grade. If you're having any issues, please get in touch with me, okay? We can work out those issues. We can figure out what's going on. We can figure out a way to help you. You know, as far as completion and things like that, but you got to watch the videos, you got to follow along with a piece of paper, and you know, these are your notes. This is like, imagine if I'm teaching up at the board, except you can pause, you can copy down, you can follow along. You're seeing everything just as if you know, it was being taught in class. Remember to minimize distractions when you're working on this. You know, you should not have your cell phone out. You should not be texting. You should not have the TV on. You know, the only thing that should be up is your assignment. And if that's the case, you know, you can finish it in 20-30 minutes. You could be done, and then you can move on to another class's assignment. But if you're trying to learn this at the same time with all those other distractions going on, it's going to be very difficult and very challenging. The best to you and your families, and I'll see you on Wednesday.